There is a quiet transformation in 2026. The woman who once sought love now protects her peace. The one who gave deeply now measures closeness with precision. This video reveals the hidden psychology behind why powerful, independent women choose to stay single, not from lack, but from control. You'll uncover how independence becomes emotional armor, how the mind turns vulnerability into threat, and why peace can silently replace connection. Stay until the end, because the final truth will force you to question: is this strength, or the most sophisticated form of escape? Something subtle has shifted in 2026, and it is not loud, not dramatic, but deeply psychological. The modern independent woman is no longer reacting to relationships. She is evaluating them, calmly, precisely, almost clinically. What changed? It begins at the level of perception. For years, relationships were framed as emotional fulfillment, a source of belonging, validation, and shared meaning. But today, for many high-functioning women, that equation has been quietly reversed. Connection is no longer the default gain. It is a potential disruption. Because when a person builds a life that is stable, structured, and internally regulated, anything unpredictable is processed as a variable that must be justified. And nothing is more unpredictable than human intimacy. This is where the shift starts to become visible. A woman who has spent years refining her habits, strengthening her boundaries, stabilizing her emotions, and building her independence, begins to experience a different internal dialogue. Not "I want someone," but rather, "What does someone add that I do not already have?" And this is not arrogance. It is cognitive recalibration. Because the brain, by design, constantly performs cost-benefit analysis, not consciously, but through emotional weighting systems, what neuroscience refers to as valuation circuits involving dopamine and prefrontal regulation. When peace becomes consistent, when routine becomes rewarding, when solitude becomes emotionally neutral or even pleasurable, the baseline shifts. Now, anything that introduces inconsistency must offer significant value to be accepted. And most modern relational dynamics fail that test, not because connection is meaningless, but because instability has become too expensive. This is what some psychologists describe as the emergence of psychological sovereignty, a state where the individual becomes the primary regulator of their emotional world rather than outsourcing that role to relationships. And here is where things deepen. Because this pattern rarely begins in adulthood, it is often rooted in early adaptation. A child who learns, consciously or unconsciously, that emotional security is unreliable begins to internalize a simple rule: self-reliance equals safety. Over time, this evolves. The child becomes capable, independent, resilient. But beneath that strength, a silent structure forms. Do not depend. Do not expose. Do not risk instability. And as this individual matures, the strategy becomes more refined. It no longer feels like protection. It feels like identity. I am independent. I am self-sufficient. I do not need anyone. And in many ways, this is true. But psychologically, something important happens at this stage. The mind begins to associate vulnerability not with connection, but with loss of control. And control to a regulated mind is everything, because control ensures predictability. Predictability ensures stability, and stability is interpreted as safety. Now introduce love into this system. Love requires openness. Openness invites uncertainty. Uncertainty challenges control. So the brain responds in the only way it knows how. It reframes love as a potential threat. Not consciously, but through subtle resistance, delays, overanalysis, emotional distancing, elevated standards. And here, Many misunderstand what is happening. They assume the standards are about finding the right person. But often, the standards function as a filter designed to maintain emotional equilibrium. If no one qualifies, no one disrupts the system. This is not failure in dating. This is success in self-protection. Now add another layer: the reward system. In behavioral psychology, repeated success strengthens neural pathways. Achievement, productivity, and personal growth all deliver predictable dopamine rewards. You set a goal. You achieve it. You feel satisfaction. Clear, structured, reliable. Relationships do not operate this way. They are nonlinear, emotionally complex, at times irrational. So, when the brain compares a controlled system of personal success versus an unpredictable system of emotional exchange, it begins to favor what it can regulate. This is why, over time, ambition can replace attachment as the primary source of fulfillment, not because the individual lacks emotional capacity, but because they have found a more stable source of reward. And this brings us to the modern environment. The dating ecosystem in 2026 is characterized by abundance, but not necessarily depth. Endless options, short attention spans, minimal emotional investment. From a psychological perspective, this creates what is known as decision fatigue and value dilution. When options increase, perceived value decreases. When effort decreases, emotional significance weakens. For a highly self-aware individual, this environment does not feel inviting. It feels inefficient. And inefficiency, to a structured mind, is unattractive. So the response is not emotional rejection. It is strategic disengagement. Gradual, intentional, quiet. Energy is redirected from seeking connection to refining self, from emotional investment to personal expansion, from romantic uncertainty to internal clarity. At this point, something profound happens. Solitude is no longer a temporary state. It becomes a preferred condition, not because of loneliness, but because of coherence. Everything aligns: time, energy, focus, emotional state. There are no external disruptions, no negotiations, no emotional volatility, and the nervous system begins to relax into this pattern. Now, here is where one of the most interesting findings appears. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology highlighted that individuals with high self-sufficiency and emotional regulation often report lower dependency on romantic relationships for overall life satisfaction. Not because relationships lack value, but because their internal systems are already fulfilling many of the roles traditionally associated with partnership. In simple terms, they are not avoiding love. They are no longer relying on it. And this creates a new psychological reality, where connection becomes optional, not essential. But every system has a trade-off, because while independence increases control, it can also reduce tolerance. Tolerance for imperfection, for emotional unpredictability, for human inconsistency. And love, by nature, contains all of these elements. So the more refined a person becomes internally, the more difficult it becomes to integrate something that is inherently unrefined. This is what can be described as the self-actualization paradox. The closer one gets to personal perfection, the harder it becomes to accept relational imperfection. And without conscious awareness, this can lead to a subtle form of detachment. Not coldness, not indifference, but distance. A quiet preference for internal peace over external connection. And here lies the question that defines this entire phenomenon. Is this evolution or adaptation? Because from one perspective, This is strength, emotional independence, self-regulation, clarity of boundaries, but from another perspective. It is also limitation, a reduced exposure to vulnerability, a minimized experience of emotional depth, a controlled life, with fewer risks, but also fewer surprises. And human connection thrives in the unpredictable. So what emerges in 2026 is not a simple narrative. It is not women rejecting relationships. It is individuals recalibrating what they are willing to tolerate, raising the threshold, refining the criteria, protecting the internal environment they have worked hard to build. And for many, the conclusion becomes clear. Peace is not something to negotiate. It is something to preserve, even if that means walking alone. But the story does not end here, because beneath the structure, beneath the control, beneath the independence, there remains a fundamental human truth: the need to be understood, not managed, not analyzed, not optimized, but seen fully, without calculation. And that is something no system can fully replace. So the final insight is not about choosing between independence and love. It is about awareness, understanding when independence is a strength and when it becomes a shield. Because the strongest life is not the one that eliminates risk entirely, but the one that knows which risks are worth taking. And sometimes, the most controlled person in the room is the one who has simply decided never to be vulnerable again. Why Gen X women refuse to play the digital validation game. She's about to appear on your screen, and what you're about to see will change how you understand her silence and her power.